So what I thought I would do today is work through a little bit on level 3 questions and what they look like and how to approach them, and then talk through the mark scheme. So it's going to end up being quite a big video, but hopefully in the comments I'll let you know at what point each part comes in. So we'll start with level 3 questions. So if you aren't familiar with the questions, they're a statement form rather than a question. So these are the 2019 statements. And at the top of the page, you will see what I've just put off to the right hand side in yellow there, is that your process for answering these should be the extent to which you agree. So you might find that you fully agree, partially agree, or completely disagree. And that means that you can have limitations to your phrasing and to your argument. You do not have to go completely one way or the other. In fact, some of the best essays are those which allow you to have a recognition of the extent and that there is an extent to that. And that can apply to your generalization of your whole argument, or an extent which is you defining the word to create an extent that you agree with it. So the qualitative words are kind of there for you to define and work with them. So that's things like meaningful, skillful, effective, precise, great, worthwhile. You kind of define them. You define what skillful means, you define what effective means. In your eyes, effective might mean that they help to show an idea. Meaningful might mean that it helps to convey theme or character. So that's up to you to define those terms. You might just go with just stating them, but if you're aiming for merit or excellence level responses, giving some form of definition of those phrases and what they mean in your eyes, that's what's going to help lift you and produce more of a meaningful argument. These next words, these are the ones that you really want to unpack and go with for your argument. So these qualitative words, you just want to agree. You want to agree that your text has an effective setting or a skillful writer or a meaningful structure. You kind of agree with those parts. It's these ones that you want to be able to have flexibility and that you can argue. So, for example, you might argue that it's not actually discomfort, but rather comfort, which is important, and what a skillful writer carefully crafts or creates. You might argue that the language provokes the deepest ideas, and that's pretty straightforward, but you might argue that great imagery actually doesn't make us examine ourselves, it makes us examine the world around us. So those are the ones that you can have a little bit more flexibility with, and that's where you can further unpack and define what engaging means and what the purpose behind using these are. Just stating that it is deep or it does create discomfort is really an achieve level response. By unpacking them further and defining them and creating an argument around them, that's what's going to lead to more convincing or potentially perceptive or insightful arguments. So to give you an idea of what I mean by that, if we look at this question here, which was a really, really popular one in 2019, a character who overcomes difficulties becomes more engaging. So an achieve level response would be that a character who overcomes difficulty makes them engaging because we connect with them emotionally. A merit response might say that character A overcomes difficulty, making them engaging, and we can connect emotionally, but there is an extent to that argument, and character B does not overcome a difficulty, but we are still engaged by showing us an emotional connection. And then more of an M6 response would say that that is the success therefore comes from the journey as opposed to whether they overcome or don't overcome a difficulty. So that creates an extent argument, and also if you were to take it into what that shows us or what that means or what the author's created, that would take you into that next step. And then going in beyond there, an excellence response might be that character engagement not comes from the difficulties they face, but the journey they go on, so building on that previous argument, and the lessons we can gain from them. And that shows that engagement comes from not only intellectual stimulation, but emotional stimulation, and therefore is both of those aspects. So that's where they would take that term engaging and argue that engagement comes from not just emotional or intellectual, but both, and the lessons that we gain from that emotional connection. So really just building on what you can take away from that statement. So that's just a very quick thing about questions and statement choice. You just want to be, as I've said in the previous video, really careful, know what the words mean, highlight what the words mean, and you'll get the most meaningful response. Now, the marking criteria. Coming from level 2, it doesn't seem potentially that scary. The jump from level 1 to level 2, where it goes from sort of 3 or 4 things that you're graded on, to level 2, where it's something like 8 things that you're graded on. Level 3 is kind of just a natural progression from there. In fact, in some ways, gaining achieved at level 3 can be slightly easier, because all you have to do is formulate an argument. And that sometimes takes away some of that analysis stuff, which people find tricky. But if you're aiming for anything above an A3, you won't find that it's easier. And if you're at that top end, or you're aiming for that top end, I hate to say, but it's going to be hard work to get that at level 3. It definitely is. So first up, is the first thing you're graded on is your understanding of the aspect. So the aspect is the focus of the statement. So as I said in the first video, those aspects remain. You'll see those key components of a text study in those statements. So that's why I said you've got to search for the ones you know. But those key aspects, things like character, setting, imagery, language, conflict, relationship, it's your understanding of that aspect. Getting into merit means that you have to be convincing. So that means you've actually thought about that aspect a little bit more. You haven't just said, this character goes through this, here is an example of this, here is my argument of this. You've actually thought about more. Perhaps you've thought a little bit about theories behind how those characters have got there. Perhaps you have considered how their journey as a character has impacted that, how they've changed or developed. So that's what's meant by convincing. It's a little more beyond this character did this. It's this character did this, and this is why, and this is the contrast, and this is the lesson we gain. Insight and perception means you have an interesting reflection on that. So you might have considered how the contextual elements of the character, the history that they're in, the political movement they're involved in, how that influences things. You might have think about how the writer's time of writing has influenced this, and you might also consider perhaps how you as a modern reader influences this. Having that contextual element, having historical understanding of themes, characters, relationships, all that sort of stuff is the thing that builds us in beyond achieve. For example, discomfort in the text reveals our internalized guilt around our own attitude to women, or a question that asks us to examine ourselves shows us that we all, under the eyes of Freud, have deep-seated childhood angst. So those sort of insightful or perceptive commentary that is present. It goes beyond just a reading of how it is in the text, and rather becomes a reflection on the wider world, the context, the political and historical influences, modern interpretations, how we've been positioned, those sort of things. If you don't understand that, that's okay. But if you don't understand that and you're aiming for excellence, then you might want to kind of unpack and reflect on those ideas and listen to this a couple of times. The next aspect is, for the marking criteria, is your argument. So this is the key defining aspect that draws us away from level 2 and makes it level 3. You've got to have an argument. So an argument, for the sake of an achieved student, is just saying that you agree or you disagree. It's generally easier to agree. Students that have the ability to twist a statement and disagree automatically will find themselves fitting up a little bit higher, because they've got the ability to reflect on those aspects more, as long as they've obviously got the analysis to back it up and the evidence and everything like that. But producing a straightforward agreed argument doesn't have to limit you from any potential grades. But if you can see extents to it, you're probably thinking at a higher critical level anyway. So your argument is just saying that you agree, disagree, or both. Having one of them, you're going to achieve. As you can see there, all you need to do is have a relevant argument. But if you are moving beyond that, then you want to have a linked argument that builds over the paragraph. So instead of just saying that we see an effective setting, here it is in 3 different places, if you move beyond that and say how that setting has developed over the course of the text, you're going to probably get a better grade because of that. So that's a linked argument, and that's something that you'll see in the structure component of the assessment criteria as well. Maturity comes from your ability to see wider concepts going on. So to reflect maturity, it might be in your use of language and your use of structure, your selection of evidence, your awareness of human condition, considerations of your limitations of the argument. So that's the whole largely agree, however, it is worth considering part. And maturity just comes from, your development and reflection on the ideas that are there. So your ability to see that there are limitations, your ability to see that the writer has placed you in a certain way and that's formed your argument, or that is an element of your argument. That's where maturity comes from. And then often if you have maturity, if you can reflect on it a little bit further, you'll lead yourself into insight. So that's where those parts of the criteria are, and that's what they mean. The next part is your engagement with the text. So this can be somewhat hard to understand. So engagement means your understanding of the text, but also the fact that you're not just regurgitating teacher notes, and you know the text quite well. You know how the text links. Obviously the evidence, obviously the story, the connections across the story, so a character's development, the way the theme can be seen in different lights, the way that a relationship changes. So that's that development and contrast. Your awareness of quotes helps to show an engagement. Your awareness of the use of language helps to show an engagement. And your contextual understanding helps to show an engagement. So that means your awareness of history, along with other aspects of it. The best responses have plenty of evidence and awareness of placement of evidence in the text. That's an easy way of showing your engagement outside of the text. So if you look at the criteria, which goes from I've got A3, A4, M5, M6, E7, E8. So what you'll see from the M5 above is that it says that you may move beyond the text in critical analysis with partial success, or may move beyond in critical analysis, may move outside the text. So the may is something to consider and be aware of. So it is worth giving a go to move beyond the text and have those wider world considerations, but just letting you know that if you don't get them in there, that's not going to be your make or break. It is there as a may. They can help your argument. However, one thing that I would urge is that the best responses, which go beyond the text, then link them back to the context at the time or the human condition. So you might discuss the evidence with consideration towards people of colour at the time of publication, or you might discuss the evidence with an awareness that you're a modern reader. You might discuss the evidence that is there to show engagement, and then you might show that engagement further by connecting it to the world around you. But then you want to connect that to human condition, or to show that you have a more modern interpretation because you are a modern reader. You weren't born and reading this in Shakespeare's time. Or you weren't in the civil rights movement with Maya Angelou. So that's kind of where that comes from. The next is your critical response. So this is your thought and reflection. Critical response shows your ability to have an argument and the fact that you've reflected on it and you're looking at those things that make a text a text. So your thoughts and analysis, your reading between the lines. So for example, the relationship between Hamlet and Ophelia reflects the wider attitudes of men to derive pleasure from the domination of women. Or the idea of power in Richard III reveals those who feel rejected will actively seek approval in a far more dominant and voracious manner. That's the inferences or personal understanding or awareness of themes. And that awareness of themes, once again, can be contextual. So those people that have the ability to see that the text was written in a time, it reflects thoughts of a time, it reflects interactions of a time, and then you're reading it now and how it's still relevant or how that's changed, that shows a really critical response. That shows that you're not just looking at a very surface level, but you're have the ability and you have in fact reflected further to think, well, how does this reflect structures that I can see around me today, or is this relevant for me? So that can come in the form of critical response, wider text connection, the ability to see that a character has progressed and what you can learn from that, analysis of the language, development of character, different portrayals of the same thing, consideration of purpose, commentary on human nature. That's where your psychoanalysis theories or your critical lenses might come in. If you've been taught things from a Marxist perspective, for example, or a third wave feminist perspective, that's where those things come in. They show your ability to view a text in a different way and critically respond to it rather than just consuming it, seeing that these characters are there and just saying they're engaging, or seeing that the setting's there and saying it's engaging. There were some really great essays that I read last year, which looked at Great Gatsby and the relevance of decadence at the time and how it linked into socioeconomic wealth and the structures that were restricted within there and how that ultimately linked to a huge historical influence. Those really showed critical response really, really well. The next bit is how you write. So what you'll see is that you kind of need it. You need to have accurate writing and spelling. You're not going to get marked down if your spelling's really bad, but if you can't understand the concepts because of the writing, spelling accuracy, then that is going to limit things. Appropriate word choice, grammatical correctness, and fluency, so it's easier to understand. If you're aiming at the higher end of the market, these things will limit or excel you depending on whether they're a strength or a weakness. So you can have some clumsiness, as you see with the merit stuff, so minor or irrelevancies or clumsiness. But if you're aiming at those upper ends, you need to be really fluent and well worded and clear in your writing style. It needs to be formal. You need to use analytical language, therefore, hence picks rather than things like the shows. That shows a sort of maturity as well. You steer away from a formulaic style and you kind of have some personal voice. Obviously, if you don't have all these criteria, that's not going to mean that you can't do well, but you're going to find that the best essays do have that. And if you're aiming for above a kind of M5, then you really want to make sure that your writing is fluent and helps with that. So this is the manner of which you're writing. I often get asked about handwriting. If you can't read it, you can't mark it. So as I said before, your teachers are English teachers. They're going to want to try their hardest to read everything, but if they can't, then they can't. And then you just have to pick up what you can understand from what you can read, and then that becomes an issue. So if your handwriting is really difficult to read, it could potentially impact your grade, yes. How you're writing, if you're not writing accurately, if your spelling's bad, it's not going to be the end of the world, but the best responses tend to have the best writing manner and style in terms of the words and language used. And structure. So this is the first level where you're actually assessed on that and it becomes a relevant part. So in levels 1 and 2, this isn't in the criteria, it's wanted, and structure and things like that are ideal, but for this one, the fact that they specifically mention introduction, links, paragraphs, and conclusion is a unique aspect. So you do want to follow an essay structure. If you're not doing it already, you obviously want to do it. Typical clear paragraphs, linking between them, which I addressed earlier in the video. If you're looking at that higher end, what lucid means is clear and easy to follow. Your writing flows well. You've got an enjoyable essay to read. You've got fluency and it works together. So your idea or awareness that a text develops and your argument develops, that's what's going to be up at that top end as well. And last part of the criteria is appropriate evidence. So evidence is quotations, and obviously if you're looking at this with a light of 3.2, that's film techniques. You can have specific scene and event descriptions as well. Quotations are key. So quotes are best, 2 to 4 per paragraph. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have 2 to 3 sentence long quotes and have 4 of those. You might have one really quite lengthy quote, a sentence long kind of quote, and then the rest of that paragraph might be supported by shorter 1 or 2 word, 3 or 4 word kind of snippets that build. The reason that you want plenty of quotes is because they give you the ability to show engagement and have evidence, but also they support a discussion because then you can analyze language use, how it reflects character, those sort of things. If you can weave quotes in, that's going to help. Weaving means that they become part of the sentence rather than having a classic sentence starter like a quote which shows this is. That's totally fine. You're not going to be marked down because you don't have those. Nothing marks you down. If there's one thing you can take away from NCA is everything they look for is an opportunity to see if it can come up to that next criteria and if it suits that next criteria to mark you up or look to reward. If you look to reward and you find things that you can reward, you're not going to then mark down because of something. So you're always looking at what you can reward. If you can weave them into the sentence, it will flow better and it does look better for you. And the last thing is the range. So you'll see that that's something that builds you beyond beyond and achieved is from throughout the text. So not just quotes that are clearly evident that from your plot description that goes around them, they're only from the first third of the text because that was the bit the teacher read in class and you didn't bother reading the rest of it. You need to read the text. They should be from throughout the text. Read the text, highlight them, make notes, and have them accessible to you because it's going to help you big time. You're level 3. You need to read your text that you're being given. the film is not the same as the book. That's another key aspect. So how do you prepare for this? Essay planning. Always practice planning. Always practice and agree and disagree. Practice your ability to find those arguments. Even if the disagree argument's really weak and you wouldn't use it, practice the ability to think of it. Being able to think on the spot, and the more you do that, the better at it you get. And then you might actually find that you can find arguments for both of those, and that could work really well. Practice writing, same as above. If you've done a practice plan and you can see that there is a glimmer of a weak disagreement argument, you could maybe get that to work. Write the paragraph for it. It might not work, but you might find that in the exam, you could see something. And if you haven't practiced disagreeing with the statement, then you're limiting yourself. So always practice agreements and disagreements, and always practice essay writing. If you can get your teacher to read a paragraph, see where you've gone. Essay writing and practice writing doesn't have to be full essays. Once you get closer to the time, it is really meaningful to practice under timed conditions. But while you're in the process of it, go for both. Just get as much writing mileage as you can get. Look at what you can agree and disagree with. So from the beginning of this video, you generally agree with the qualitative thing, like skillful and worthwhile, but you can disagree with the fact that it has to be another world, for example. So really break down those things, break down the sentences, break down the statements, look for words you know, look for what those words mean, think about how you could twist and define them. Read exemplar essays. If you are on the NZQA website, you'll find them from the last sort of 3 or 4 years. Try look at the M6, E7, E8 ones and see how they build that criteria and how they get it there. What is it that they do that is unique or special? Quote collection. This is essential. A range of evidence is essential. Read the text. Read it again. Make notes, make lists, memorize them, have flashcards, look at the language. What could you pick apart? If you received that as a text from someone you fancy or an angry mum, what would be the words that stick out? Consider viewpoints. How would an event be viewed by the character, the other character there, another character, the audience at the time, the writer, and audience now, you as a young modern audience? Your awareness of being positioned is essential to success. Unpack and evaluate the author's purpose and write some notes on this. So look at the author's purpose in a particular scene or event and look at the purpose overall and try and make connections between them. Read up on basic theories, so political theories, gender theories, psychoanalysis theories. If your teacher is not teaching you them, that's totally fine. I didn't teach them my first year either, but they're out there. They're pretty easy to find online. There's so many amazing YouTube clips out there which have heaps on that sort of stuff as well. And if you look on Scholar, you'll probably find them linked to your text as well. Read the news. Be aware of the world around you, what's going on, and how it might be similar or different to the existence of your text and what's going on there. So these are just some sentence starters that I created that will help you kind of work through them, so it might be worth copying them down. These are just things that can help reach or hit parts of this criteria. It is worth noting blank's use of a language feature number. This is significant when we consider, this is where you can connect the wider text but also the context. This contrasts with earlier, later in the text when, that shows your ability to show engagement and build upon it. Perhaps blank wants us to consider author's purpose. What did they want us to consider? What were they trying to do? How were they trying to place us? This largely depicts traditional thinking of the time as, if context is relevant, use it. You've got to utilize it. Your teacher's probably chosen that text for a reason. And these ones as well. It is alarming, thought-provoking, insert adjective here. Simple personal response, shows engagement with the text. Offers the opportunity for flair in your writing, which takes it away from a formulaic approach and also can make it less simple and more critical. It is important to reflect upon. So this one can lead to events, language, the wider context, the wider world, but also your awareness of how you're positioned as a reader as well. A simple sentence, once again, very blatant. Here, blank has positioned us as an audience too. Here, Shakespeare has positioned us as an audience to consider, ... And then another language one. blank's use of blank is significant as blank's Shakespeare's use of metaphor is significant as, and then you go into it. So those sentence starters are quite simple, but they're really effective ways to link to the criteria and kind of help you along there. And that's it. Thank you.